Thomas vividly remembered the day he had to give up his dream of having a family of his own. That was when the events that had brought him to this awful place began. While he was going through his options, he lost the only woman who truly loved him. Already in his childhood years, Thomas' parents noticed that their son was constantly squinting and could not see well into the distance. Deciding that standard glasses for astigmatism can help, his father gave him the rest from his older brother, who had been dead for 10 years. But the boy looked ridiculous wearing glasses. His classmates mocked him, comparing him to a mole. A crying Thomas came home and stomped on the hated frame out of anger. For that, his father hit him with a belt. It was a memory of my brother. If he didn't want to wear it, he'd just give it back. Why did you have to break it? Left alone, the boy dreamed of growing up big and strong, learning to be a car mechanic and driving a big car. The 10-year-old Thomas had a particular weakness for fire engines and large trucks with bright orange paintings. They seemed to him to be something very joyful and imposing. And from the height of the driver's seat, he could see nothing but the road ahead and the vastness of the countryside. When Thomas grew up, he first fell in love with his classmate Lily, a laughing girl with pigtails sticking out in all directions and colored bows on the ends. But the girl, realizing she was the object of Thomas' attention, ridiculed him. "Who needs you? You hardly read books. You only need to look at the cover to read something. What do I need you for? You miserable mole." Thomas withdrew into himself and once confessed to his mother that he no longer wanted to live. "Mother, why did this happen to me? Why do I see worse and worse every day? I can no longer go to school. Even the little kids laugh at me. My mother is simple and uneducated." The woman did not know how to help her son. In consultation with neighbors, she took Thomas to an ophthalmologist only when the young man began to walk literally by touch, with difficulty distinguishing between light and shadow. After the examination, the doctor only shook his head. Unfortunately, the disease is hereditary. The optic nerve almost completely atrophies with time. I would advise you to start attending a boarding school for the visually impaired as soon as possible. Also, Thomas, if you ever get married and have children, they will probably have the same problem. The boy will be almost blind, and the daughter will see little better. So think hard before you start a family. The mother cried, but there was nothing she could do to help her son. Thomas almost stopped going out, and he had to learn how to use a cane for the blind, to navigate by sounds, to build in his head a mental route of movement. The world, when almost everyone in it is plunged into darkness, looks very different than when you look at it with your eyes wide open. His father once remembered that his grandfather had the same problem with his eyesight, but at the time it was put down to typhoid fever and head trauma. But it didn't matter to Thomas why it happened to himself. The fact was there, and there was nothing he could do about it. And Thomas continued to live alone, sometimes allowing himself to relax in the company of strange women who smelled of cheap perfume and vodka in their late 40s. Thomas, having already buried his parents, sold the family nest and moved to town, pocketing the cash he had. He got on the first bus he could find and drove into town, where a week later he bought a tiny house. There were no such conditions in his parents' house. Gas electric stove, heating, shower with hot water, bathroom inside the house. Thomas was very comfortable, but needed a job to support himself and the house. He ended up getting a job at the local boiler company, on duty at night, and helping a neighbor with his chores during the day for groceries. Sometimes on weekends, Thomas would take his accordion and sing songs at the market so that people who cared would give him some money. James lived alone after his wife died. He had one acquaintance, of whom he usually spoke briefly. She was a good person, conscientious, but could not walk. Cautiously making inquiries, Thomas learned that Mia, as James' acquaintance's name was. After the accident, she could hardly get around on crutches. Her husband learned that she had become an invalid. A year after that, he ran away safely, leaving her alone in a small apartment. Mia never complained, however. With a smile, she interacted with other people and was a wonderful cook. She was the one James asked to appear at his place, sometimes to treat him to delicious homemade pies, cutlets, and other simple culinary delights. The usual fried potatoes were quickly boring, as was pasta and canned food. And Mia's help came in handy. If James wanted to eat, he would buy so much food that the woman would make him a week's supply. One day James called Mia in, and while she was in the kitchen, he went to see his neighbor Thomas. "You've been living here for 6 months. I haven't seen anybody come into your house." "It doesn't take me long to learn how to talk," James sympathized. "You know, Mia's here to see me now. Maybe we can get acquainted. She's a nice, understanding girl, and you'd have someone to talk to, wouldn't you?" After thinking about it, Thomas agreed with the help of James to find a clean shirt. The man decided to go and meet Mia. She looked in astonishment at the stranger who appeared before her, his eyes unmistakably indicative of his blindness. However, Thomas, who had fine hearing, somehow realized that the woman was smiling, and he smiled. Mia decided that Thomas was not bad enough and agreed to live with him. James would sometimes come over, and the three of them would sing songs to the accompaniment of the accordion, which Thomas had learned to play masterfully in his youth. Mia had a beautiful, deep voice that mesmerized the listener. She took great pleasure just sitting next to Thomas and watching his sensitive, dexterous fingers run over the keys, producing soulful music. But things weren't so great in the couple's lives. Both had nothing to complain about, though. Mia sometimes noticed that her roommate smelled like another woman when he didn't come home for the night. She would pretend like it was no big deal and put tasty treats on the table, which a hungry Thomas ate in minutes. He acted as if that was the way it was supposed to be, and Mia was humbled. But that was until the day Thomas came home not alone, but on the arm of a strange middle-aged woman dressed very brightly. The stranger wiggled her hips, clinking her heels, and the tipsy Thomas was only smiling. "Your rent beauty. How they stomp." Immediately I know where she is, turning her head toward Mia, who, leaning on her cumbersome crutches, was looking at the uninvited guests with eyes full of tears. Thomas gave out. Ed, tough guy, dropped her crutches and danced for me. It was as if Mia had been struck on the head. She could not understand how Thomas, aware of her condition, would make such a joke in front of a stranger, and the latter just laughed. Why should she? "Thomas, let's go to my place together and show her how to dance on the sea." Mia went to her bedroom, dressed warmly, and packed her backpack. Once given to her by volunteers, the woman kept her things in it. It was the end of October, and the evenings were noticeably cooler. The streets were beginning to be covered with a thin layer of ice after the rain. As she stepped outside, Mia noticed that the ground shimmered in the light, so the ice crust had formed again. But there was nothing to do. She decided to walk away from Thomas so she wouldn't look pathetically crippled in front of his starry-eyed girlfriends. The couple in Thomas's room didn't even notice Mia leaving. She walked slowly up the street, as usual, about to cross it to get to the bus stop. But just as Mia took a few steps forward, one of her crutches went sideways and the woman fell to her knees. At the same second, a large car jumped out onto the roadway. The impact threw Mia into the air. The paramedics, after examining the victim, were unable to help her. The collision was too hard. The driver who hit Mia explained that he didn't see her in the dark. Thomas came out of his bedroom and called for Mia, but no one answered. The man shrugged his shoulders. He knew at once that she was offended and had probably left. However, James didn't have her, and none of the neighbors had seen her that night. Character. She decided to show me, that without her I couldn't wash my underpants or cook a meal. Let her go back to where she came from on her crutches. Thomas responded angrily to his neighbor's question as to why Mia wasn't going out. When he realized he could get no more from him, James went back to his place to mutter under his breath. Who'd he turn to for help now? These groceries from the store wouldn't last long. It's a bit pricey. But after that, Thomas had new girlfriends almost every day. After a night at his place, they all mysteriously disappeared, and he tried not to tell anyone that he was pining for Mia. He realized for the first time how much she meant to him when she wasn't around. No one had ever hugged him by the shoulders like that, sang to his music, listened to him about how he'd spent the day. And how many times did he find Mia covering him with a warm plaid? When he fell asleep, then in a chair, then right on the floor. While he was polishing various metal parts, Thomas never saw her eyes, but he could imagine her looking at him, affectionately, lovingly. The silence in the house became so unbearable that he began to take different women to his house, just to avoid feeling that he was truly alone. Before, when Mia was around the house, he had never felt this feeling of emptiness. One day, on his way out of the house with accordion in hand, Thomas bumped into James. "Are you going to sing jolly songs again?" His neighbor snarled angrily. "What else have I got to do? Money doesn't come to me by itself, but it goes away easily. How is Mia?" Suddenly, James slapped Thomas in the face. "You've been having a lot of fun with the ladies, haven't you? You've been saying bad things about Mia. She's been dead a month. They buried her 2 weeks ago. They kept her in the morgue, in case anyone shows up and asks, 'What about you?'" Thomas' head was spinning from what he heard. How did she die? Was she buried already? How? He even grabbed the banister so he wouldn't fall. "My nephew got a job. He told me the other day. She got hit by a car. They couldn't save her. And you keep talking shit about her, but you weren't worthy of her at all. Why did I introduce you? If I'd known you were going to wipe your feet on her, I'd have married her myself. You bastard." That day, Thomas went nowhere. He'd never felt so ugly. He had never been so drunk. He howled like a wolf to drown out the pain and the guilt he felt for the dead woman. I imagine her falling and her crutch flying away with a loud thud. "Mia, forgive me, forgive me. I'm the last bastard on this earth," Thomas sobbed, his face against the table, because he had no strength to hold his head back. Everything was in such a fog that he didn't understand anything at all. "And I'm a stupid, blind bastard. I also took chicks here so the neighbors would tell you how much fun I was having with them. Only you don't care anymore. Mia, I'm alone now without you." Thomas didn't sleep a wink that night, and in the morning, he went to an address he knew well. It was an orphanage for the visually impaired, where many families brought their children to learn skills useful to the blind. Thomas had learned a lot in his life and could pass on his skills to the younger generation to make their lives easier. When he informed the director of the orphanage that he was willing to live there and teach the children for free, his offer was accepted. "Thomas, you have no idea how much we need people who can teach. We have mostly volunteers, but they are people with normal vision. Some things they just don't understand themselves, and it's harder for kids to find a common language with them." Then, with a stern look at Thomas, the director asked how you are with alcohol. "You don't abuse it?" Remembering how drunk he had been the day before, Thomas only grinned. "I used to. I don't deny it. Honesty is good. The main thing is to make sure the kids don't smell it on you during class." "I hope that's understandable," the principal said. Thomas, contrary to his expectations and fears, enjoyed working with the young charges. Many were learning to navigate and handle the objects around them. So the teacher, who had the same eyesight as the children themselves, could explain and tell some tricks quicker and more easily. One of the teenagers asked Thomas to teach him to play the accordion, and the teacher's troubles increased. But he was only glad for that, because with them he forgot his pain. The feeling of loneliness slowly began to fade away. Thomas felt it especially when 5-year-old William, who had recently lost his sight as a result of a domestic injury, hugged him by the neck and whispered softly, "Grandpa Thomas, you are so good. Can I sit with you some more?" His nose and eyes began to sting a lot, and Thomas pretended to sneeze loudly. When the children learned that it was his birthday, They asked their parents to organize a tea party for their favorite teacher. And this was the first time Thomas had celebrated such an occasion. The pupils came up one by one, congratulated him, and certainly hugged him. And they brought the birthday boy to tears. It was an unforgettable celebration for him. He realized that if he had a family, only one where they would love him and wait for him, where they would rejoice together over his successes and worry about his failures.